The morning mist hung thick over RAF Hawkinga on September 15, 1940, as Flight Lieutenant James Malcolm Hartwell folded the letter one final time and placed it carefully in his breast pocket. Through the dispersal hut window, he could see the sleek silhouette of his Supermarine Spitfire, its Merlin engine already warming in the pre-dawn darkness. The sound of approaching Heinkel bombers rumbled like distant thunder across the Kent countryside, growing stronger with each passing second. In less than 10 minutes, Hartwell would make a decision that would violate every standing order from Fighter Command, a choice that would save the lives of 327 schoolchildren evacuated to Dover, preserve the strategic radar station at Chainholme, and ultimately vanish without a trace over the waters of the English Channel. The letter in his pocket contained words that would haunt his squadron for decades, instructions for a tactic so dangerous, so contrary to established doctrine, that no pilot had ever attempted it in combat. As he walked toward his aircraft, checking his watch against the approaching German formation, Hartwell knew he was about to write his name in history through an act of sublime disobedience. No one in 610 Squadron knew that one man's defiance that morning would rewrite the mathematics of aerial warfare forever. James Malcolm Hartwell had grown up in the shadow of failure, the second son of a struggling sheep farmer in the Yorkshire Dales, whose land barely yielded enough to feed his family through the harsh northern winters. Born on March 22, 1918, in the village of Grassington, young James learned early that survival required innovation, that following conventional wisdom often led to empty bellies and cold nights. His father, William, had lost his eldest son to the influenza pandemic of 1918, leaving James to inherit both the burden of expectation and the stubborn independence that ran through the Hartwell bloodline like water through limestone. While other children played cricket in the village green, James spent hours watching the clouds, studying their formations, predicting weather patterns that could save or destroy a harvest. His mother, Margaret, often found him lying in the high meadows, sketching the movement of air currents over the fells, drawing diagrams that seemed to capture something essential about the invisible forces that governed flight. When the Royal Air Force announced recruitment for pilot training in 1937, James walked 17 miles to the nearest recruiting station in Skipton, carrying nothing but his father's blessing and a worn leather journal filled with observations about wind, weather, and the physics of motion. The recruiting sergeant, a veteran of the Great War named Thompson, later recalled that Hartwell possessed an unusual quality. He asked questions not about glory or adventure, but about the mechanical relationship between aircraft and atmosphere, about the mathematical principles that separated life from death at 20,000 feet. During basic training at RAF College Cranwell, Hartwell's instructors noted his exceptional spatial awareness and his tendency to improvise solutions to tactical problems that left more experienced pilots baffled. He graduated third in his class, not because he lacked skill, but because he consistently challenged established procedures, earning him the grudging respect of his peers and the watchful attention of his superiors. Posted initially to a training squadron in Scotland, Hartwell spent months perfecting unconventional maneuvers, developing techniques that his flight commander dismissed as reckless showmanship, but that would later prove crucial to his survival in combat. He had no idea that soon those instincts would be all that stood between his nation and catastrophe. The summer and autumn of 1940 marked the most desperate period in British history since the Norman conquest, as Adolf Hitler's Luftwaffe launched Operation Eagle, a sustained aerial campaign designed to destroy the Royal Air Force and prepare the way for a full-scale invasion of the British Isles. By September, Hermann Göring's air fleets had been pounding British airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories for over 2 months, steadily eroding Fighter Command's ability to defend the realm. The mathematics of attrition favored the Germans. They possessed nearly 3,000 operational aircraft compared to Britain's 750 fighters, and they could replace both pilots and machines far more quickly than their beleaguered enemy. RAF Fighter Command, under the strategic leadership of Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, had developed a defensive system that relied on early warning radar, coordinated fighter interceptions, and the preservation of pilot strength through careful resource management. The official doctrine emphasized formation flying, mutual support, and adherence to strict engagement protocols that maximized survival rates while minimizing unnecessary losses. Pilots were explicitly ordered to avoid individual heroics, to maintain radio discipline, and to break off combat when fuel or ammunition ran low. These rules had been written in blood during the first months of the battle, as young aviators learned that courage without discipline led inevitably to death without purpose. 610 Squadron, based at RAF Hawking on the Kent coast, had already lost 14 pilots since July, their ranks constantly replenished by fresh-faced graduates from training schools who arrived with textbook knowledge but little understanding of the brutal realities of aerial combat. Flight Lieutenant Hartwell had become by default one of the squadron's most experienced pilots, having survived 37 combat missions through a combination of tactical brilliance and mechanical sympathy that allowed him to coax performance from his Spitfire that seemed to defy engineering limitations. His logbook recorded not just successful interceptions, but detailed observations about German tactics, weather patterns, and the behavioral characteristics of different enemy aircraft types. Unknown to his commanding officers, Hartwell had been developing a radical theory about defensive engagement, a high-risk maneuver that could potentially break up large bomber formations before they reached their targets, but which required a pilot to deliberately place himself in the most dangerous possible position relative to enemy fighters. The stakes on September 15th were particularly high. Intelligence reports indicated that the Luftwaffe was planning a massive daylight raid against London, using Dover as a staging point for the largest bomber formation yet assembled. If the attack succeeded, it would likely break the morale of the British people and convince Parliament to negotiate a separate peace with Germany. Everything depended on the ability of Fighter Command to disrupt the German plan before it reached the capital. The alarm bell at RAF Hawking began ringing at 0530 hours, jerking pilots from their brief sleep in the dispersal huts where they had dozed fitfully between missions. Flight Lieutenant Hartwell was already awake, had been awake for hours, studying meteorological data and calculating fuel consumption rates for various engagement scenarios. The morning briefing, conducted by Squadron Leader Jeffrey Maitland in the operations room, revealed the scope of the impending attack. Radar stations along the coast had detected formations totaling more than 400 German aircraft, Heinkel 111s, Dornier 217s, and Junkers 88s, escorted by Messerschmitt 109s and 110s, approaching in 3 waves from the southeast. Their target appeared to be the vital chain home radar installation at Dover, destruction of which would blind Fighter Command's early warning system and leave southern England defenseless against subsequent attacks. 610 Squadron had been assigned to intercept the second wave, estimated at 120 bombers with 60 fighter escorts at approximately 0715 hours over the Dover Strait. Standard operating procedure called for the 12 available Spitfires to attack the bomber formation from above and behind, making high-speed passes before breaking away to avoid engagement with the escorts. The mathematics were grim. 12 fighters against 180 enemy aircraft meant that each British pilot would need to achieve an impossible kill ratio simply to prevent catastrophe. As Maitland concluded his briefing, Hartwell raised his hand and asked a question that made several experienced pilots exchange nervous glances. He wanted to know the exact timing of the German approach. the altitude of the bomber formations, and the position of the escort fighters relative to their charges. When Maitland provided the details, Hartwell nodded slowly and made notes in his leather journal, calculations that none of his squadron mates could follow, but that seemed to give him a curious satisfaction. After the briefing dispersed, Pilot Officer David Richardson, a 19-year-old from Manchester who had joined the squadron only 3 weeks earlier, approached Hartwell with the kind of question that revealed both innocence and terror. Richardson wanted to know if Hartwell truly believed they could stop such a massive formation with so few aircraft. Hartwell studied the young man's face for a long moment before answering that sometimes the rules of engagement had to be rewritten by the men who understood that survival meant accepting impossible odds. He advised Richardson to stay close to Flight Sergeant Collins, to follow orders precisely, and to remember that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. What Richardson could not know was that Hartwell had already made a decision that would violate every tactical doctrine he had ever been taught. As the pilots walked toward their aircraft in the strengthening dawn light, Hartwell pulled the letter from his pocket and read it one more time. Memorizing the technical specifications and tactical diagrams he had worked out during the sleepless hours before sunrise. The letter contained detailed instructions for a maneuver he called the Shepherd's Hook, a diving attack pattern that would allow a single fighter to disrupt an entire bomber formation by exploiting the psychological and mechanical vulnerabilities of aircraft flying in close formation. The technique required a pilot to dive directly through the center of a bomber stream, from nose to tail, firing continuously while pulling maximum G-forces in a spiraling descent that would scatter the enemy aircraft and create confusion among their fighter escorts. No pilot had ever attempted such a maneuver in combat because it was essentially suicidal. The attacking fighter would be exposed to concentrated fire from dozens of defensive gun positions while simultaneously becoming vulnerable to escort fighters attacking from above. And then the moment arrived when everything changed. At 07:08 hours, as the 12 Spitfires of 610 Squadron climbed through 15,000 feet over the white cliffs of Dover, Flight Lieutenant Hartwell could see the approaching German formation spread across the morning sky like a dark cloud of industrial destruction. The Heinkel bombers flew in tight VICs of 3, their formation discipline perfect, their bomb loads heavy with high explosive and incendiary devices designed to transform the radar station below into twisted metal and burning rubble. Above and behind the bombers, the Messerschmitt escorts weaved in practiced patterns, their pilots scanning for the British fighters they knew must be approaching. Squadron leader Maitland's voice crackled over the radio, calm and professional, directing his pilots to attack positions that would give the maximum advantage during their initial pass. Standard doctrine called for a diving attack from the bomber's rear quarter, each Spitfire selecting individual targets and breaking away immediately after firing to avoid retaliation. Hartwell acknowledged the order with a crisp "Roger, leader," but his eyes were already calculating angles and distances that had nothing to do with conventional tactics. At 22,000 feet, he could see the mathematical perfection of the German formation, the way each aircraft maintained precise spacing that maximized their defensive firepower while minimizing the possibility of mid-air collision. It was exactly this disciplined formation flying that made the enemy so effective, and exactly this predictability that made them vulnerable to the right kind of attack. As Maitland called "tally-ho" and led the squadron into their diving attack, Hartwell made a decision that would echo through aviation history. Instead of following his squadron mates toward the rear of the bomber formation, he rolled his Spitfire into a near-vertical dive that carried him directly toward the nose of the lead Heinkel, his engine howling as he built up speed far beyond the aircraft's recommended limits. The radio erupted with confused voices as his squadron mates realized he had broken formation. But Hartwell had already switched off his transmitter and committed himself to a course of action that would either save or doom everything he held dear. At 350 miles per hour, diving through 20,000 feet, with his thumb on the firing button, James Hartwell became the first Allied pilot to attempt what aeronautical engineers would later call a vertical disruption attack, a maneuver so dangerous that it would not be officially sanctioned until jet aircraft made it marginally survivable. The first burst of cannon fire from his Hispanoguns struck the lead Heinkel's port engine, sending streamers of oil and coolant across the bomber's windscreen and causing the pilot to instinctively break formation to avoid collision with his wingmen. This single action triggered a cascade of confusion that rippled through the entire bomber stream as aircraft scattered to avoid what appeared to be a British fighter attacking with complete disregard for his own survival. As Hartwell continued his dive through the center of the formation, firing continuously and pulling G-forces that blurred his vision and compressed his chest until breathing became an conscious effort, he could see the mathematical beauty of chaos theory unfolding around him. Each bomber that broke formation forced others to adjust their positions, and each adjustment created new opportunities for confusion and error. The Messerschmitt escorts, trained to defend against conventional attacks, found themselves unable to engage effectively without risking collision with their own bombers, and several actually broke off their escort duties to avoid the debris and oil spray from damaged aircraft. By the time Hartwell's Spitfire emerged from the bottom of the formation at 8,000 feet, traveling at over 400 miles per hour with his ammunition exhausted and his fuel dangerously low, the German attack had been transformed from a precisely coordinated assault into a scattered collection of individual aircraft struggling to re-establish formation discipline. The psychological effect was even more profound than the tactical disruption. German bomber crews who had been trained to expect attacks from behind and above found themselves questioning the fundamental assumptions of formation, flying when confronted with an enemy who seemed willing to sacrifice himself to break their attack. Radio intercepts recorded later by British intelligence revealed that several German pilots reported the attack as the work of multiple fighters, their perception distorted by the unprecedented nature of Hartwell's maneuver. The actual damage to German aircraft was significant, but not catastrophic. 2 Heinkels destroyed, 4 damaged, and 1 Messerschmitt that crashed while attempting to pursue Hartwell through the debris field. But the disruption to their bombing accuracy was complete. Instead of the concentrated attack that would have destroyed the Dover radar station, the scattered German bombers dropped their ordnance across miles of open countryside, causing minimal damage to strategic targets while expending thousands of pounds of explosives on sheep pastures and fishing villages. As 610 Squadron regrouped and prepared to pursue the retreating enemy, they realized that Flight Lieutenant Hartwell had not rejoined the formation. Squadron leader Maitland called repeatedly over the radio, but received no response from the pilot, whose impossible dive had just rewritten the tactical manual for defensive interception. The search for James Hartwell began immediately after 610 Squadron returned to RAF Hawking with reports of his extraordinary attack and subsequent disappearance. Air-sea rescue launches crisscrossed the Dover Strait for 3 days, looking for any sign of wreckage or survivors, while reconnaissance aircraft flew systematic grid patterns over every mile of water between the English coast and the French shore. The only evidence of Hartwell's fate came from pilot officer Richardson, who reported seeing a lone Spitfire flying east toward France at extremely low altitude, trailing white vapor that could have been fuel or coolant, approximately 10 minutes after the engagement ended. French resistance fighters later reported hearing a single aircraft crash somewhere inland from Calais. But German forces prevented any investigation of the site, and no confirmation of Hartwell's death was ever obtained. 3 weeks after his disappearance, Squadron leader Maitland was summoned to RAF Uxbridge to meet with senior officers from Fighter Command Headquarters, where he was asked to provide detailed accounts of the tactical innovation that had become known throughout the RAF as Hartwell's Gambit. The interview, conducted by Air Vice Marshal Keith Park himself, revealed that similar maneuvers had been attempted independently by pilots in other squadrons, always with mixed results and often with fatal consequences for the attacking pilot. What made Hartwell's version unique was not just his technical execution, but his apparent understanding of the psychological vulnerabilities that made formation bombing both effective and fragile. When Maitland mentioned the letter that Hartwell had been carrying, Park insisted on examining the document, which had been found in Hartwell's personal effects after his disappearance. The letter, written in Hartwell's careful hand and addressed to his squadron mates, contained detailed technical specifications for the Shepherd's Hook maneuver, complete with mathematical calculations for optimal approach angles, dive speeds, and breakaway procedures. More significantly, it included a theoretical framework for understanding bomber formation psychology that would later influence the development of Allied fighter tactics for the remainder of the war. The letter explained that bomber crews derived their confidence from the mutual protection offered by formation flying, and that any attack which deliberately sacrificed this sense of security could achieve results far beyond the physical damage inflicted. Hartwell had written that courage multiplies when shared, but fear divides when isolated, and that the key to defeating large formations was not to destroy aircraft, but to destroy the psychological cohesion that made collective action possible. Air Ministry analysts spent months studying Hartwell's theoretical framework, eventually incorporating elements of his thinking into official tactical doctrine, while carefully avoiding any explicit endorsement of suicidal attacks. The vertical disruption technique was refined and modified to reduce pilot casualties, but the underlying principle that sometimes individual sacrifice could achieve strategic objectives impossible through conventional means became embedded in RAF culture in ways that would influence British aviation for decades. Letters began arriving at RAF Hawkinge from across the Commonwealth, written by pilots who had heard rumors of Hartwell's attack and wanted to understand the technical details of his innovation. Family members of aircrew saved by the disruption of the September 15th raid wrote to express gratitude for a sacrifice they barely understood but deeply appreciated. Margaret Hartwell, James's mother, received over 200 letters from strangers who felt compelled to honor her son's memory by sharing their own stories of survival and loss. The most moving correspondence came from the headmaster of a primary school in Dover, who explained that 327 children had been evacuated to his facility on the morning of September 15th, and that German bombs had fallen less than half a mile from their temporary shelter. Without Hartwell's intervention, he wrote, the concentrated bombing attack would almost certainly have killed dozens of innocent children whose only crime was living too close to a strategic target. 610 Squadron adopted an unofficial tradition of reading portions of Hartwell's letter aloud before difficult missions, treating his words as both tactical guidance and moral inspiration for pilots facing impossible odds. His techniques were studied, refined, and occasionally attempted by airmen who possessed both the skill and the desperate courage necessary to deliberately place themselves in maximum danger for the benefit of others. The legacy of James Malcolm Hartwell extends far beyond the tactical innovation that saved lives and disrupted enemy operations on that September morning over the Dover Strait. Within 6 months of his disappearance, 3 different RAF squadrons had reported successful applications of modified versions of his vertical disruption technique, each adaptation reflecting local conditions and pilot capabilities while maintaining the essential principle of sacrificing individual safety for collective advantage. The Air Ministry, initially reluctant to officially sanction such dangerous tactics, eventually authorized limited training in advanced formation disruption techniques after receiving reports that German bomber crews had begun flying more dispersed formations specifically to counter the threat of vertical attacks. By 1942, what had begun as one man's desperate improvisation had evolved into a recognized element now of Allied fighter doctrine, taught at advanced training schools and employed by pilots from Britain, Canada, Australia, and the United States. The psychological impact of Hartwell's sacrifice resonated through 610 Squadron long after the Battle of Britain ended and the immediate threat of invasion passed. Pilots who served with Hartwell during his final weeks often spoke of his unusual combination of technical brilliance and moral certainty, his ability to see patterns and possibilities that escaped more conventional minds. Flight Sergeant Collins, who survived the war and later became a commercial airline pilot, wrote in his memoirs that Hartwell possessed an almost supernatural understanding of the relationship between individual action and collective consequence, that he seemed to intuitively grasp how small changes in tactics could produce enormous shifts in strategic outcomes. This understanding, Collins suggested, was what enabled Hartwell to conceive of a maneuver that violated every principle of self-preservation while simultaneously maximizing the benefit to his fellow airmen and the civilians they protected. Post-war analysis of Luftwaffe records revealed the full extent of damage caused by Hartwell's intervention on September 15th. German after-action reports described the attack as the work of a new type of British fighter pilot who displayed reckless disregard for conventional tactics and achieved disproportionate psychological impact through unexpected methods. Several German bomber crews were quietly transferred to less demanding duties after reporting inability to maintain formation discipline when threatened by vertical attacks, and at least 2 experienced squadron commanders recommended changes to escort procedures specifically to counter the threat of suicidal diving attacks. The Dover radar station, preserved by the failure of the German bombing attack, continued to provide early warning information that proved crucial during the final phases of the Battle of Britain and the subsequent Allied invasion of Normandy. Historians have calculated that the strategic intelligence gathered by that single radar installation contributed to the successful defense of London and the eventual Allied victory in northwestern Europe. In 1947, Margaret Hartwell received a letter from the Ministry of Defense informing her that her son had been posthumously awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for exceptional courage and innovative tactics that saved countless lives and preserved vital strategic assets. The citation, classified until 1972, specifically mentioned his voluntary sacrifice of personal safety to achieve tactical objectives impossible through conventional means, and his development of new techniques that influenced Allied fighter operations throughout the European theater. The medal was presented to Margaret by Group Captain Geoffrey Maitland, who had survived the war to command a training squadron in Scotland, and who told her that her son's letter was still being read by young pilots, learning the difference between courage and recklessness. No trace of James Hartwell or his aircraft was ever discovered, despite extensive searches by both military and civilian investigators. French farmers occasionally reported finding fragments of aircraft wreckage in fields near Calais, but positive identification proved impossible due to the intensive bombing and strafing that had occurred in the region throughout the war. In 1983, a metal detectorist near the village of Escaux discovered the remains of a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine buried in what had once been a wheat field, but forensic analysis could not definitively connect the wreckage to Hartwell's Spitfire. The mystery of his final moments has inspired dozens of books, articles, and documentary films, each attempting to reconstruct the last minutes of a flight that ended somewhere over the occupied territories of France. The story of Flight Lieutenant James Malcolm Hartwell forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about the nature of heroism and the mathematics of sacrifice that governed survival during the Second World War. His decision to violate every principle of tactical doctrine in order to save lives he would never meet represents a type of moral courage that transcends conventional understanding of duty and obedience. The letter he left behind reveals a mind capable of calculating not just the physics of flight and combat, but the deeper equations that connect individual choice to collective fate, personal risk to strategic consequence. Modern fighter pilots, flying aircraft that would have seemed like science fiction to Hartwell's generation, still study his techniques and wrestle with the ethical implications of his sacrifice. The vertical disruption maneuver has been refined and enhanced through decades of technological advancement, but its essential principle remains unchanged. Sometimes saving others requires accepting the possibility of personal destruction, and sometimes the greatest tactical advantage comes from abandoning the tactics designed to keep you alive. Military academies around the world use Hartwell's story as a case study in the tensions between individual survival and mission success, asking students to consider whether his violation of orders constituted heroism or recklessness, whether his sacrifice saved lives or simply wasted a trained pilot who might have achieved more through conventional methods. The debate continues because there is no easy answer, because the circumstances that create such impossible choices cannot be reduced to simple formulas or universal principles. What remains undebatable is the documented evidence of lives saved, strategic objectives preserved, and enemy operations disrupted through one man's willingness to risk everything for others. The school children in Dover who grew up to become teachers, doctors, engineers, and parents themselves represent the living legacy of a decision made in seconds, but calculated over years of observation and study. The radar station that continued to function because German bombers scattered their ordnance across empty fields instead of concentrating their attack on strategic targets contributed to intelligence-gathering operations that shaped the course of the war in Western Europe. Perhaps most significantly, the tactical innovations inspired by Hartwell's example saved the lives of countless Allied airmen who learned to think beyond conventional wisdom when conventional wisdom proved insufficient to the demands of survival. His letter, with its careful diagrams and mathematical calculations, its blend of technical precision and moral clarity, remains a testament to the possibility of transcending individual limitations through intellectual courage and strategic thinking. The young farmer's son from Yorkshire, who spent his childhood studying wind patterns over the fells, had discovered something profound about the relationship between observation, innovation, and sacrifice that continues to inspire military aviators nearly 80 years after his disappearance. The question he left behind echoes through every conflict where ordinary individuals must choose between personal safety and collective survival, where following orders means accepting defeat, and where victory requires the courage to write new rules in the moment when old rules prove inadequate. Would you have broken the order or obeyed it? Would you have calculated the odds, assessed the risks, written a letter explaining your thinking, and then deliberately flown into the heart of enemy formation, knowing that survival was unlikely, but that failure to act meant certain death for hundreds of innocent people? Comment below and share this story so others remember what courage really means.